I can hear you.
Very good.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, please. Good afternoon. How are y'all doing today?
Okay, you're breaking up on me.
Oh, no, okay.
I don't have a consistent connection.
Okay, let's see. Okay, how about now? Is this better?
Yes.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, cool. Cool. So good afternoon. How are y'all doing today?
We're doing
Pretty good.
fine. I guess this is my wife, Susan.
Hello.
Apetebia Yafa, Olo Oshun. Okay.
Nice to meet you,
Priestess,
Iya Susan.
yeah. Priestess
Nice
of
to meet you
Oshun
as well.
for over 30 plus years. So, yeah.
Cool.
Uhuru.
Yeah, so my name is Tarami Reedus. I'm a drummer, musician, based in Houston, Texas. And
Okay.
I'm the owner of a brand called Drumz Uhuru. And the whole mission and purpose is to elevate, educate, and inspire um, other people who are curious about, traditional African music, drumming, culture, and to also elevate the voices of those practitioners, those leaders, those pioneers, those elders in the spaces that are inspiring me, informing me, and influencing the culture at large as I see it and I'm experiencing it. And, Baba Felix, you and I were talking. I read you all's book, Ilú Añá, Sacred Batá, and it's very impactful on my journey. And I would just like to have you all on here to talk about the book, the process that you all went through to co-write it, your experiences in these traditions, and any insight that you have on the culture as you see it today, particularly as it relates to the artistic side, so music and dancing. So yeah, without further ado, could you each give a brief introduction to who you are and how you came to be, respectfully a musician and a dancer?
You're freezing up on us.
Uh-oh. Okay. Is this
I'm
better?
losing you. Not quite. I hear you, but your face is frozen.
Okay.
No, now I can't hear you either.
Okay. Is it better now?
A
Yes.
little bit, or yeah, I could hear you at least.
Yes,
Okay.
I see you.
Well, I can see y'all pretty good, so we'll just keep rolling with it. Were you all able to catch my question?
Absolutely. So, Susan, I guess you should be the first one to introduce yourself and talk about who you are.
So my name is Susan Richardson Sanabria. Um, I am an Olo Oshun. I was crowned in 1993 in Bronx, New York. Um, so I was a dancer before I crowned. And so the tradition, the dance and the tradition was something that also attracted me to this tradition. As some of the other religious traditions kind of frown on dance or dismissive or something to that nature. So Orisha worship appealed to me in that way, among others. So I've been practicing, as he said, for over 30 years. Very much involved in music and dance because not only was my husband also a musician, but our godmother was also a musician and dancer, a singer and dancer. So that has been a sort of ongoing part of my learning and my involvement in the tradition. Um, to some extent, I have been involved in teaching people as well as learning the dances, trying to help, continue that tradition because it seems that on one hand, there are more, say, dance studios and workshops that people offer in dance, including Orisha dance. However, sometimes when you go to ceremonies, you find that a lot of people at the ceremonies don't actually know the dances. A lot of the elders, of course, have have been well trained in that, but a lot of the newer priests in the last, say, 20 years especially, have not, unfortunately, also always been well informed or well trained in that aspect of the religion, which for us, we don't see it as a sort of aside to the ceremonies or the rituals or the work that we do, whereas it's more intrinsic, it's more specifically a part of Orisha worship, both dance and music.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Very important, very integral. And I agree with you. I would like to, learn some of the dances in the movement because, as you all know, the sound and the movement go hand in hand, but we can get into that later on. Baba Felix, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Felix David Sanabria, born and raised in New York City. All right, I was born in 1954 at a time where obviously civil rights and culture was changing here in the Americas. All right, our music had just arrived in this country. By our music, I mean music from the Caribbean, as people were migrating from the Caribbean to the North. This is a historical fact that has happened with the African Americans when they wanted to get out of the Jim Crow South, and with Caribbean Americans or Caribbean people in general who wanted to have a better life because of the economic situations and political situations that were happening in the Caribbean. Being born and raised in New York, I was exposed to the music of New York. At the time that we were born, my wife and I, rock and roll was still new. Okay, the mambo era was in effect. Okay, and of course, politics had a way of intervening with our cultural growth when the Castro government took over Cuba and the U.S. started an embargo against Cuba, preventing us connection with the Cuban culture and peoples. You see, and because of that, then our culture was marginalized in the sense that we only had here what connections we may have had to Africa. You see, and at the time that we were coming up in the '60s, as we all know, the civil rights era was at hand, and people were looking for a cultural identity. Myself as a Puerto Rican, New Rican as we call ourselves, I was looking for that connection through our music, all right, and culturally, because obviously, in schools they were not giving us this education, all right. Obviously, people talk about DEI. Guess what? They haven't been teaching proper African American history for decades in this country since I was a kid. When I was a kid, we didn't hear anything about Africa or the Caribbean, and any of that I started getting exposed to that. But at home and in the streets, it was a different thing. At home, I was being exposed to Puerto Rican culture, Afro Puerto Rican culture. Some of the music that my parents used to play, I used to, as a child, dance to that, and because of that, I got involved, playing music. And my father used to see me banging, and he got me a set of bongos. Okay, and of course, at that time in the early '70s, salsa was big. The whole Fania Records thing was happening. And us young Latinos in New York, and not only Latinos, but African Americans, again, looking for cultural identity, we kind of hooked up with the music craze of that time, namely, R&B, the Motown sound, and the Fania, the Latin sound. And of course, Latin soul was involved in that too. So as I was growing up, first, when I was a teenage, a young kid, it was the mambo, cha 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 sound of my mother had in the house. But then, going to school, I was exposed to the Beatles, to the R&B sound, everything from uh, Martha and the Vandellas to Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell and the birthing of the Jackson Five. You see, in addition to that happening, we were then, with the Fania sound, a lot of New Yorican musicians, or not just New Yorican, but Afro-Cuban Cubans that remained behind, and also Dominicans and other people in our communities that wanted to play Afro Caribbean music, specifically Cuban music and Puerto Rican music, were now creating bands and the sound that we grew up listening to. And of course,
Yeah.
the key thing to all of that was what? The drum. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, and it's kind of weird because one of the things I say is that a lot of people in the Caribbean get their, they get to popular music via religious and home music or street music, if you will, which is what things like rumba is to an extent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because of that, we took it to the streets of New York. We started playing drums in the streets of New York, and that kind of put me on a road to find out exactly what the drums meant in our culture, especially when there were references to African deities in the music we were listening to at the time.
Yeah. So that kind of leads me to my next question. Dear Susan, about Felix, what inspired you to write this book, Ilú Añá? What does it mean for you guys, and what does it mean for the community? Yeah.
Well, one of the things is that we were going to different bembes and the drumming ceremonies, that people would come up with questions to me, to Baba Felix, about the drums, about how if they were going to present a drumming themselves, perhaps in a reading they were told they should do that. It might just be a custom of their house to do it for themselves or their godparents, but in any case, how to set it up, what are the protocols in saluting the drum. People, are generally taught that early on as an initiate, but sometimes they forgot, sometimes it wasn't really well explained to them. So they want to review how properly to do that for themselves, and also because they may be in the position of initiating another person and want to be able to guide those godchildren correctly into Anya. And also understanding that it accompanies so many of our ceremonies and the work that we do. That being able to sing is being able to pray, is because most of us in this diaspora are not fluent in Yoruba, but the songs help us to express ourselves in Yoruba language, which we find again is another way of connecting and strengthening our connection and being in tune with our culture and our ancestry.
Well, in addition to what Susan just pointed out of helping people in the community and explaining things in the community, I wanted to touch base. A couple of things that I wanted to do in addition to what Susan said, and one of them was to help people have a basic cultural understanding of what the deity Añá represented. Okay, we try to give an explanation as to what it means to say that you're Añá, what the drummers are, who the drummers are. Well, another thing that I wanted to touch on the historical aspects of the drumming. One clear thing that I tried to do, we tried to do in the book, and that is explain how the Batá tradition and Orisha traditions were started, at least the musical traditions of Orisha was started here in the United States. Okay, there's extensive information on how it started in Cuba. The guy that started that was a gentleman by the name of musicologist by the name of Fernando Ortiz, which I have most of his books here that explain to you how is it that the Afro-Cuban phenomena came to be. And the Afro-Cuban phenomena, as we know, gave birth to much of the music that we listen to today, just like jazz that came from New Orleans, that came from spirituals and practices in the Baptist church were then emulated through R&B, you see? So that was one of the things. And, another thing, talk about the historical aspects. I wanted to touch on the beginnings of how the drumming started. Everything from who were the first person to bring the drums to the U.S., Batá, right, into Cuba. Who were the first into Cuba, and then the first person to bring it into the U.S. First person to bring it into the U.S., people don't realize, was Catherine Dunham. There's a museum in East St. Louis, the Catherine Dunham Museum, that has a set of Batá there. Now, they didn't necessarily play them that much because the only guys that could play them at that time when she brought it with her were two gentlemen that actually were the first two to bring the Añá tradition to this country from Cuba, namely Julito Collazo and Francisco Aguabella. Aguabella did it in the West Coast. Collazo did it in the East Coast. You see? So anyway, these are historical things. Then the other thing that I wanted to talk about history was how Batá drumming started in the United States. Okay, how is it that people like myself, like you, would be interested in this tradition that we were not born into? You see, and that's a key thing to understand. A lot of us were not born into these traditions, but yet we make them now something that we practice, that now generations after us are born into these traditions. You see? So
And
that's
I was
a key
talking,
factor to understand of how, how it is that now all of a sudden we have second, third, even fourth generation practitioners of young folks like you that have parents, that have grandparents, that have elders that have lived since the beginning of the time that initiation started in this country. You see, and that's an important thing for us as Americans to understand, because even though we love Cuba, we love Puerto Rico, we love Africa, but guess what? This is where we lay our heads to sleep. This is where we live. This is where we break bread. This is where actually we honor the earth
absolutely.
that's here on this in this country. So, and for those people that say that African culture doesn't exist in this country, of course, this proves them dead wrong. Okay, because
I
there
was
is a
talking,
generational uh, there is a
hmm
generational growth of the
And
African
continuum.
and continuum, yes, which is again young folks like you. You're about 25. We're about two generations ahead of you. You were probably born in the beginning of this century, whereas us, we come from the middle of last century. So that ought to tell you something in terms of how why we see this happening.
yeah. I
So
was
one of the
talking
things.
with a good friend of mine, and I was sharing with him some of my, I guess, slight discomfort, as you mentioned, with, being an American, being an African American, and being a relatively, new practitioner, right, to these traditions and to, Bata drumming. And I was sharing with him how sometimes it can feel kind of, I feel somewhat of an outsider because, I'm not from this country, I'm not from this part of the world. And, he reminded me that, all of these things, all of these practices and these art forms and cultures are originally African, are at their core African, and that by extension grants me a right to access it, to learn it, to study it, and to pay my respects and my homage to it. So I want to say thank you both for this work that you're doing is truly truly phenomenal. I want to ask you guys what what are some ways that we can or that we can continue to maintain a standard, right? And the efficacy, of these practices and the actual content, if you understand what I'm saying. Susan, you mentioned how
So
people are forgetting the dances. What are some ways that we can to keep that going? I know a lot of people on the drumming side, things get lost. Certain things get misunderstood, right? So how can we keep that going forward?
well, you want to answer that first, or should? Uh,
Well,
well, the way I look at it, it's a simple thing. We got to maintain ourselves organic. Okay, it's great to learn bata drumming in a classroom. It's great to learn it from a book. As Westerners, actually, that's one of the ways that bata drummers started in this country. They picked up Fernando Ortiz's music transcripts and were looking at that and listening to recordings. In other words, we were trying to learn the music from the outside of the culture. But now that we're in the room, or in the Igbogdun, in the room of the sacred grove, as we call it, then now that's where we have to go back to do these practices. It's great for somebody to go to a dance class and learn how to dance for Chango, but the real place to really learn how to dance to Chango is in front of Anya okay, with your godparents next to you, showing you the steps on how to dance to Chango. All right. To give you I have an anecdote about my learning process in the book. I had gotten a grant back in the 80s to study with Puntilla, Orlando Rios, o ni Chango o Batilemi, o Ilú Batá o Molañá, y Baeva Tunutim Dumare, who was our mentor when it came to learning the drums. All right. And I asked him, I said, Puntilla, how was it that you learned how to play drums? How was it that you became an Omolaña? And he said, Feli, what I would do is I would go show up at the Ilú Bata's house every day. All right. Then I would go and carry the coconuts and the drums to the place we were going to play. I would offer drinks and water and clean the sweat off the drummers, and then stand behind each drummer, learning each part and learning how to play like that. And I told him that's exactly how I wanted to learn. Because back then, people were taking classes of Batá in a classroom. And one of the things that we have to look at is how did that happen? And before 1960, to give you, just to give a date, all right, or before the Cuban Revolution, to be more specific, all right, Cuban Batá and the tradition of Cuba, you had they wouldn't teach you if they, you'd have to show up at Bembes literally every weekend, maybe the 2, 3 at a weekend for you to even get an idea of how to play this. It was very secretive. You see what I'm saying? It wasn't as open as it is now. But then when the Cuban Revolution happened, all right, the Cubans now were under Russian rule to an extent. And Russia, as Susan can attest to, having an MFA in fine arts and dance, she studied ballet and some Russian ballet, if you will. And their way of teaching was a conservatory style of teaching. Hence, when the Cubans wanted to preserve the Cuban culture and saw that how rock and roll in particular was knocking Cuban music off the charts, they said, hey, we have to find a way to preserve this Cuban culture. And they came up with the Instituto Cultural de Cuba that they have now. Now, of course, they came up with the Folclórico Nacional de Cuba, which all of us have heard of, probably seen for the past 40, 50 years. One of the first times I seen Folclórico Nacional de Cuba was in February of 1980 when they showed up in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. You see, and of course they presented a show of folklore of bata, palo, rumba, tumba francesa, comparsas. You see, something that we were not exposed to here, even though we had the salsa scene, we had the R&B scene, but it was not anything that was really associated fully with being African. You see,
Yeah.
so understanding how the Cubans changed their way of teaching that, and then of course, how that in a way transpired to us here. My first classes, if you will, were, I remember my first class of drumming was with a famous drummer named Gene Golden. You see, so again, we were not learning the folklore on the street level, at the home level, if you will. We weren't learning it in the bembe. Now we were learning it by listening to popular music, and then from the popular music, taking it down to the bembe. You see? So again, my thing is that it's great for us to have the dance classes and the music classes. It expands the knowledge of Batá, of Orisha music in general, and dance to the general public. But what it does do, it takes away from the ritual means of what these dances and music represents. You see? And
Yeah.
therein lies our dilemma now. Okay? We can't have people going to dance classes, especially people who were not initiated to learn these dances. And then when they go to the bembe, when they're playing for Chango, they don't know how to change their steps with the song or the rhythm that we're playing. You see? Because the thing
Right.
about that is that in general, this is a storytelling process that we are producing. It's what the Africans or Yorubas call oriki. Okay, oriki is a storytelling process of what it is that we do, who we are, who the Orishas are, what Ifa is. You see what I'm saying? So, and also maintains our ritual lineages, you see? And therein lies part of the issue there. Susan, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, on one hand, part of it too is investment. I mean, like he was talking about going day after day, week after week. It's not
Hmm.
like an instant thing. I think sometimes, unfortunately, people are attracted, but more like it's a fad or a fashion statement. You know, we had
Yeah.
some people say, "Oh, it's the Alekis. You know, can I get them to match a certain outfit?" Well, it's not. It's not a fashion statement. It's not about matching your outfit. It has to do, with the spirits that you're representing there. So, that's related to in terms of the dance. So we celebrate, we have festivals, but it's not like a party in the sense of like anything goes, although sometimes people think that's the case, but that's not really the case. So there is a particular framework. Like you said, we're listening to the singers and the musicians because they're calling Orisha, and they're calling on certain of the stories through the verses that they're singing. So, it relates to, whether it's Oshun and it's something about water, or Yamaya, whether it's Chango and it's something about lightning, it's something specific. It's not just a random, we're having fun dancing to the rhythm. So, we're trying to encourage people to understand, and that's partly with the book too, to see, there's a specific group of songs that have a specific sequence related to how we are conducting these ceremonies.
Yeah, and of course that's a
Yeah.
learning process that goes
Sure.
by, because one of the things for people like us, I mean, technically my first Orisha songs I got off of records that where Celia Cruz was singing her first songs for Orisha. So and why? Because when I was living in the New York City projects, if you will, we didn't have the ability to be, first of all, be close to the earth. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is we didn't have the cultural connections, if you will. Even though my parents tried to maintain Puerto Rican culture living in urbanized New York, it wasn't fully it wasn't fully covered, simply because of the fact that they had to work with the conditions, or we had to work with the conditions that we were living in. You see what I'm saying? At home, my parents spoke in Spanish, but when I got to school, everybody was talking in English. At home, I'm listening to El Trio Los Pancho, Cortijo, and Tito Puente. At school, I'm listening to the Beatles, James Brown, and things like that, and jazz like Miles Davis. You see, so again, we had a kind of cultural disconnection in that sense, and that's a phenomena that has happened to many of people in our African American community, to the point that it's kind of weird. I hear some African Americans denying their Africanism, and of course, that's kind of
Yeah.
you even I mean, even some of the white Americans deny their Europeanness, if you will. You see, for the base of them trying to be what do they call it, natives, if you will. Make themselves
Yeah.
natives of this land. You know, and
And I think
there,
that's one thing that's very profound too, is the ability to receive confirmation, right? That, you know, who we are on our paths is there's space for it. There's space for us to be all of who we're meant to be, right? So thank y'all for those answers. Uh yeah, Susan, I would like to ask you specifically about the role of women in this tradition, specific to Anya, because I love the way, it was laid out in the book. Definitely picked up some gems, things that I've never seen before happen still, right? So
Uh,
can you just talk about the importance of women and the role of women in Anya, but also in the broader context of, African traditional cultures?
you're breaking
yeah.
up.
Okay. So my question is, or can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, Susan, can you shine some light on the importance of women in the role of traditional African drumming, Anya, etc., as well as traditional African cultures?
Well, as he introduced me earlier in the beginning as an epetapi, that is a role that women have with Anya. And it's
Anifa.
yes, Anifa, but we're talking about Anya right now. It is a support role. There's a kind of uh, back and forth, I will say, with women and Anya from the standpoint that women are primary eleguns or mediums. And so the role of Anya is to draw Orisha to the mediums so that they can then communicate with the community. So on one hand, certainly it's not like women should not be around Anya. I mean, a whole community is going to be coming around, and it definitely should include women. There is a sense of kind of I'm trying to think of the energy of Anya as technically a kind of female, because each drum enclosed is considered to represent in some ways a womb, because the sound is birthed from the drum, and in birthing this sound, it also gives birth to the ability of us collectively, as we're singing, to call on Orisha and to bring Orisha into our presence. So there have been a lot of things said about not having women play or be involved, and women do not play Anya, well, while they may be playing Batá. So we do make that distinction in the book. There is a consecration to a drum that becomes Anya that is not the same as just a regular, if you will, Batá drum. Or instrument, right. This is not necessarily just exclusive to Batá.
Wow, that's powerful.
So I don't know if I totally answered your question, but
yeah, definitely. That's
You're
very
breaking
deep.
up. Rami, you're breaking up.
Okay, is this better? Can you hear me?
No, yes, better. Yeah,
to freeze.
So better.
Yeah, you
okay.
But at least we can hear you.
Okay, all right, cool. Yes, thank you, Ia. That was profound, very deep. My next question, and this might be the last one because we got about 5 minutes left on the meeting. And I would like to hear from each of you, what is the relationship between movement, like physical movement of the body, and sound, right? Because I think those are two very key elements, in these cultures, and everything that you all have been practicing and studying, and that I'm beginning to, on my journey. So, what is y'all's take on that relationship?
Well, I would say, one of the things is clearly you can't have one without the other. Okay, there's no way. When you look at let's look at the human body. Okay, the human body is the main instrument. A friend of mine named Skip Burney, a good associate of mine, famous drummer. He's been around for 40, 50, 60 years, something like that. One time told me a drum is not a drum without a drummer. Okay, it's just a piece of log with a skin on it. In other words, the human body in and of itself is the real instrument that we're looking at here. You see, and what the human body can produce. The human body can imitate bird sounds. Thereby it can create music, creating them. It could create other sounds of nature. All right. So we are able to then create music with our voice. All right. It could create singing different pitches. You see, we can also play the first instrument technically that we play is our own body. All right, we clap. We learn how to clap, and things like that. And hit our bodies. And you hit your chest, it's going to have a different sound than your hands, or your face. You see what I'm saying? So that is the key there. and of course the dancing aspect, with rhythm, it's all connected because it has also all to do with the four cardinal forces of music and of the world: rhythm, harmony, melody, and tempo. You see? So if you apply those, then you can easily apply that to any aspect of life. All right, or any aspect. This is why, again, the arts are so important. And talking about Orisha and Ifa practice, one of the beautiful things of African practices in particular is how each and everything that we do it has to do with communal help and communal professional work. If you are going to make the pots for Ogun, need to do metallurgy. You need to know that. You need to know that to be able to make the copper, the brass, the silver tools that the Orishas have. If you're going to have a drummer and have things for Chango, you need to have somebody who's a wood carver. You need somebody that knows how to hollow out a tree trunk to make a drum. You need somebody that knows how to deal with skins and cloth. You see, you need to have the tailor there to make the clothes for all of us. You see,
Right.
if we're going to talk about Anya, we need all of that for Anya. You need somebody to be able to cook the foods. You have to be a specialist for that. You have to have a specialist that's going to lead us in song. You have to have a specialist that leads us in drumming and music. You see, so you see, there's different aspects and protocols, if you will, within our own within the Orisha Ifa practice that has to do with Anya. You
But
see,
when it comes to movement, I would say a couple things. One is the drummers are dancing too.
yeah, Iboru.
Because you can't play these drums without moving, and
Mm.
it's not just a simple flexing the wrist. There's a lot more to what the drummer has to do to produce that sound of Anya.
And one of the things I would like to add, I'm going to share something our godparents shared with us. All right, our Iya Orisha, our godmother, was the late Evelyn Smart Olo Shuno Kantomi by. She was a dancer and a singer. She always taught us, make sure you learn how to sing to your Orishas. Make sure you learn how to dance to your Orisha. Another one that lent that type of support was Mayubong of Ocha, the late James Hawthorne Chief Bay, Oni Chango Bailu. All right? So, Ibae Bai Tumutim Beleselo Dumare. Ayailu, I said Obailu, I meant Ayailu. So he was another one that taught us. He would teach us in his uh, Ileomo Olofin, his house of Ocha, all his godchildren to be able to sing to their Orishas, be able to dance to their Orishas, even dare play for their Orishas. Each Orisha, as we put in the book, they may have different instruments, and of course the instrumentation that we have is partly because of the different regional ways in Africa that people had of praising Orisha. If you were in the land of Obatala, you played the Igbing drums for Obatala. If you were in the land of Iyesa, you played the Yesa drums for Ochun. If you were in the land of Egbagdo, you played the Egbagdo drums for Olokun. And if you was in Ile Ife, you play Ipese for Ifa. You see? So you see how these different instruments all come together, if you will, that there's a whole cosmology of instruments that we use to be able to praise Orisha. And again, this is part of the communal connection that